You even organized an interview with Hans Zimmer over email. I still remember that. I launched a message board and it blew up, and it was like 50 plus women, pretty much. That's all it was. And I was at the time 24, 25, and I'm interacting with these
Isn't that amazing?
much
Yeah.
older fans and all that. And it became that message board ran for 6 years just talking about Gladiator.
This is very telling because a lot of people, I mean, this really wasn't that long ago, right? I mean, we're talking about
No.
25 years ago, 24 years ago. Again, there was almost no social media. There were people like you that were curating and cultivating these fan communities. We, meaning on the record company side and on the marketing side, we were like, "Ooh, this is good." What we used to call in those days, it was a viral marketing. Like, how can it go viral?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Kingdom of Dreams podcast, The Making of Stories. I'm your host, Jawad Mir. Today, my guest is Randy Dry. Randy Dry is Vice President of Brand Management at SiriusXM. His connection with me was very interestingly 25 years ago when I used to run a DreamWorks fan site, and he was the one who was heading Universal Group music department and also soundtrack department, which kind of gets discussed in this episode. And he was able to provide my website probably about 50 or 60 Gladiator soundtrack CDs for promotional purposes that we used as a contest to gain audience and which benefited my website ridiculously. And then after that, I started doing that regularly. So that was a connection. I messaged him and he graciously said yes. And great conversation with him, mostly in the music world. I loved his skill set of storytelling, and I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Something a little bit different from traditional film talk, but please do enjoy my conversation with Randy Dry. I would love to just start off with your career. You know, how it began. Was it always in the music? Was it always in, marketing slash PR, whatever that was? Just kind of guide me through that, your beginnings, and
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It, yes, I have always wanted to pursue a career in the music business for as long as I can remember.
Mhm.
It really comes down to my lifelong passion for the Beatles. So it's their fault, those four lads from Liverpool, that I chose this career path. But I couldn't be happier, and I was stricken with Beatlemania at a very early age, and there's no cure for that. And fast forward to now, and now I'm very fortunate to actually work with the Beatles team at Apple Core in the UK, and also our partners at Universal Music here in Los Angeles on the Beatles channel on SiriusXM. So I'm part of the team that launched the Beatles channel back in 2017, which premiered in conjunction with the 50th anniversary of Sergeant Pepper. And
Hmm.
that was a monumental launch, and it is still is quite a thrill and a labor of love for me. And I must say that 13-year-old me would never imagine that now, not only do I get to work with the Beatles team in London, but Paul and Ringo and they love the channel, and so do Sean and Yoko and Olivia and Danny Harrison, and it's just a tremendous honor and privilege to be part of that legacy and to continue to turn on millions and millions of fans, both re-engaging old fans and helping to turn on new fans of all ages. It's just a remarkable honor and a privilege. And to me, it really hit home. We at the Beatles channel, once a year, you may know that Ringo, on his birthday, on July 7th, he will do an event to celebrate his birthday in honor of peace and love. So he uses his birthday as a platform to promote peace and love throughout the world. And so wherever anyone is at noon, whether it's Toronto or Los Angeles or Italy, France, Japan, Australia, wherever you happen to be at noon, Ringo encourages everyone on July 7th to say peace and love, just like that. And so we at SiriusXM's The Beatles channel, we have been proud sponsors of that event for many, many years. And at one of the events, Ringo's wife, Barbara Bach, came up to me and one of my colleagues and said, "You know what I really love about the Beatles channel is that I learn so much about Richie, Ringo's real name. I learned so
Hmm.
much about Richie by listening to the Beatles channel because I hear him tell all these stories that he's never told me. And you play all of these songs by Richie that I never heard before." And that was something that 13-year-old me never could have predicted. And that's pretty special. And then, of course, when Sir Paul, uh, stops by and records something for the channel, and then it's like Beatles channel, all right, man, can't beat that. So, it's better than a real job, what I do, and I'm very lucky to still be allowed to do it. So let's see. That was how it all started, really. My love for the Beatles, and which, turned into a full-blown love of all kinds of music. And I always wanted to be in the music business, and, starting, way back when I was in high school, which was in the 80s. um, there used to be these places, you may have read, in the history books about this. There used to actually be brick and mortar stores where you could buy pieces of vinyl and
Hmm.
called records, and also pieces of plastic called CDs. Uh, Here in Los Angeles, they still have a bunch of those stores, but sadly, many of those stores no longer exist, as you know, the music business has long ago transitioned from physical sales to streaming. But when I was in high school, that's all I wanted to do was, as soon as I was employable, I went to work for what was at the time the largest record store in Chicago. And it was then, at age 15, that I first learned all about Ticketmaster and how that works. And tell you a quick story here.
Sure.
In those days, and you may recall this, really the only way to get concert tickets was at the prescribed time when tickets would go on sale, you would have to uh, pick up your phone. Again, these were landlines.
Yep.
There were no cell phones. And you had to try your luck by dialing and redialing the Ticketmaster number as fast as you can and hope and pray that you would get through, which almost never worked. Or you could go to either a large record store like the one I worked at, or a department store, which would be designated as a Ticketmaster outlet. And so these stores, like the record store I worked at, they would have a computer terminal, and these were old school computers. Like this was not, you know, not Macintosh. We were not
Yep.
in the Mac world yet. These were old computer terminals like that, bankers would use. And but people would camp out overnight, and in Chicago, that meant sometimes in the freezing cold, and they would camp out sometimes for several days and nights, so that they would be first in line when the tickets went on sale at that store. And so I remember this was in the 80s. I think it was for U2.
Mm.
And there were people camping out for several days outside of the store. In the morning, we would bring them coffee. We became friendly with these people. And then tickets would usually go on sale at on Saturday morning at 10 a.m., right? So at 9:30 a.m., we would open the doors and we would march everyone in single file. Everyone's really excited. They've been camping outside for days and very little sleep, but they were all pumped up and ready to be first in line and get the best concert tickets they could. So clock strikes 10, and I'm new to all this, right? So my store manager says, Randy, you stand next to me and I'm going to show you how Ticketmaster works. So literally, it's this old computer terminal, and then next to it is a printer with blank ticket card stock. So you would type it in, type in the show you want, how many tickets you want, you'd process the payment, and then it would spit out the appropriate number of tickets. It would just print them right there, and you'd hand them to the customer. Clock
Wow.
strikes 10. First person in line is all excited, and my store manager types it in as fast as he can. Two tickets come up, and they are all the way in the back of the main floor. The person standing in line can't believe it. He's like, "What? I've been waiting outside, sleeping outside for 4 days. Why am I not sitting front row center? It's 10 o'clock on the dot. I'm first in line." And I too had the same question. And, my heart just sank. I felt so bad for this poor guy. And my manager said to him very pointedly, look, there are a lot of people in line behind you. Time's a ticking. You want these tickets or you don't? He said, yes, I'll take the ticket, but he was very disappointed. And I whispered to my store manager, like, what just happened? He said, listen, Randy, I got to get through all these people in line. Then I'll show you how it works. So that is when I learned that when tickets go on sale, and this was long before there were pre-sales but the basic premise is still pretty much the same in that when tickets go on sale, or certainly in those days, not all the tickets in the venue went on sale. And in many cases, some of the best tickets were held back. And they're held back for the artists or for the management team or for the record label or for the tour
Sponsors.
promoter, sponsors, radio stations, VIPs, et cetera, et cetera. 15-year-old me was like, wow, really? And so then I'll never forget this. And the store manager said to me, Randy, is there a show coming up that you would like to see that is sold out? And I said, yes, I'd like to see REM, right? Because our REM was just becoming very, very big in the late 80s. And he said, okay, make sure you schedule yourself to work here at the record store on the day of the show. every 30 minutes, just swing by the Ticketmaster computer here, next to the cash register, just, because I would be working the floor as a salesperson. He said, just every 30 minutes, come by and enter in REM that you want 2 tickets for that night's show. And he said, I guarantee you at some point during that day, it might be just a few hours before the show, a couple great tickets will pop up, grab them, buy them, enjoy the show that night. And that's exactly what happened. And that trick, although it's not really a trick, but that methodology still works today. But you don't have to go to a record store or a Ticketmaster outlet. You can obviously do this all from your phone. And of course, there are many, many, many sophisticated bots out there that move a lot faster than your fingers and my fingers in terms of dialing or even just having it redial and redial. But it's very, very, very rare that a show is truly sold out. So even a superstar artist like Taylor Swift, when she plays multiple dates at huge football stadiums, more often than not, if you wait until either the day of the show or maybe just keep checking in the days leading up to the show, you often will find tickets because what will happen is those tickets that are held back will very quietly and quickly be repopulated or recirculated so that the general public can buy them. And it's just sort of, are you in the right place at the right time, or did you dial in at the right place at the right time? Um, but it can be anything from the people who, maybe 10 tickets were held for a certain entity and they only needed 4.
Yeah.
Or maybe some credit card transactions got canceled. Or maybe someone was planning to go but couldn't get a babysitter for the night. All sorts of scenarios. But sometimes shows are truly sold out. Like if you have a big artist in a very, very small venue,
Yeah.
then it can be truly sold out. But when you have a superstar act or even just a not superstar act in a large enough venue, it's you can always find seats. You may have to pay a little bit extra depending on what the situation is, but that's something that I learned a long time ago. And so then this is a very roundabout, long-winded way to answer your
No, no,
question.
no. This is fine. This is lovely. I'm loving it.
Okay, well, good. I'm glad. I hope your listeners are loving this too. But I had an epiphany then when I was 15 years old, because as much as I love the Beatles and buying records and collecting records, which I still do, I also love going to concerts, and I still do. What I don't love is what happened to that poor guy who waited outside for 4 days and then thought he was going to get front row center and was all the way in the back of the house. So I remember thinking to myself when I was 15, if I want the best concert tickets, I need to either become friends with someone in the music business or get a job in the music business myself. And not at a record store, but either for a radio station or for a record company. So that's what I did. Now, I then was faced with, well, how does one get a job at a radio station or record company? And that's when I quickly learned there are really 2 ways, and this is still the case. There's 2 ways that I know of to get a job in not just the music business, but this goes for the entertainment business in general. One is to have a close friend or family relative who's already in the business who can help you get a job.
Right.
I did not have that luxury. So I went with option number two, which is get an internship and basically prove to the company that you're interning for that you will work your tail off for nothing or next to nothing. Or in my case, it was college credit. And occasionally, I would be sent out to get lunch for everyone, and I could get myself lunch too. That was a huge luxury. That was a big bonus. But once you got inside, then you had access to all sorts of things, free promo records, free concert tickets, and you got to learn by doing and by watching and learning. And those were wonderful days. This was late 80s, early 90s, and I went to college at Boston University and lived at BU's radio station, WTBU, where I was, the music director there, and um, basically emulated the radio stations that I loved in Chicago and in Boston. And I didn't basically my theory was if it's good, we'll play it. And late 80s, early 90s was a very exciting time in radio and in music in general, because that was just at the dawn of what became known as alternative music. So, I mean, I remember working at my college radio station and hearing Nirvana for the first time, or Mother Love Bone for the first time, which became Pearl Jam, and Red Hot Chili Peppers for the first time, and Jesus and Mary Chain, and all sorts of fabulous bands. And Boston also had a very exciting and thriving local scene with bands like the Pixies and Breeders, and we were big champions of the local Boston scene. But while I was working and virtually living at my college radio station for those 4 years at Boston University, which I loved, I was also interning at a legendary rock radio station that is sadly no longer with us, called WBCN, the Rock of Boston, a legendary FM, what they used to call freeform rock radio. And then that was when I was in Boston during the school year, and I would come back home to Chicago for the summer. And that's when I started to intern at the Loop, which WLUP, which is still around. It's another legendary rock radio station, trailblazing. And it was very, very exciting to be at both of those stations, because you never know who would show up. Like one day, the Stones would be there, and one day Aerosmith would be there, or Bon Jovi would be there, or whoever would be there. And but in Chicago, I began interning for the music director, a wonderful man named Dave Benson, who is still around. He's in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I learned a lot from him. But Dave Benson shared an office, and it was a rather small office inside the giant John Hancock building in downtown Chicago. He shared an office with Gary Meyer, who was one half of the legendary Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer afternoon drive radio team. And this was the number one most listened to, most popular, and in those days, most controversial and shocking uh, comedy talk radio show in not just in Chicago, but really for the entire United States. And Howard Stern learned a lot and borrowed a lot from Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer, until obviously Howard eclipsed them and everyone, and to this day is still, in my opinion, the most talented and amazing radio broadcaster of all time. Um, but it was literally as simple as Steve and Gary needed an intern themselves. And Gary was sharing an office with Dave. I was interning for Dave. So I was only like 10 feet away from Gary. And he looked at me and said, hey, do you have some extra time? We could use some help. And so I said yes, because I grew up listening to Steve and Gary, and they were legends in Chicago radio and in the Midwest. Real innovative, hilarious, rule-breaking, groundbreaking, what was then known as shock jocks. And they would get fined all the time by the FCC, as would Howard famously later. But over the years, while I was in college and home for the summer, I graduated or was promoted from intern. Actually, my what they called me on the air wasn't intern. They called me cabin boy Randy. So I was promoted from cabin boy, which is sort of glorified gopher, to assistant producer and ultimately to producer. And the Loop and Steve and Gary in those days, they were on the air weekdays from 2:30 to 7 p.m. And then on the weekends, they would have a best of show, which I would produce and co-host. And it was an incredible experience. But I've never taken so much abuse on and off the air verbally, uh, ever. But I knew exactly what I was signing up for. Steve and Gary were famous and notorious for uh, their revolving door of producers. But I knew the drill, and I remember Dave and others at the Loop cautioned me, and they said, "Randy, are you sure? Like, you went to a good college, you're a smart guy. Are you sure you want to be Stephen Gary's producer? Because eventually you'll just be kicked to the curb like all the other ones." And I said, hell yes. Like, of course I do. Like, I'm about to graduate college. This is the number one rock radio station, not just in Chicago, but in really all of the Midwest. I mean, we were heard in Chicago, Milwaukee, parts of Indiana, parts of, Iowa, Missouri. We were all over. We had millions of listeners. So I was like, yes, I want it. And it was exciting. And there were those years were a bit of a blur. But I remember things like when Steve and Gary were on vacation, they had special guest hosts. And one of the guest hosts was Joe Walsh of the Eagles. And Joe Walsh, as you may know, is now, among other things, I mean, obviously he's a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer and a legendary musician and member of the Eagles. He also happens to be Ringo's brother-in-law now.
Oh, okay.
So at the aforementioned birthday party, Ringo's Peace and Love birthday party, of course, Joe is there and his wife is there, and all of Ringo's family and friends are there. So I will reintroduce myself to Joe at these events and remind him, like, all those years ago, remember when I produced your radio show in Chicago? And that that experience, the producing Joe Walsh, was probably the single highlight of my entire career as a radio producer. I learned so much from Joe Walsh in a couple of days. Just he and I mean, I was just the student and he was the master, and I learned so much about comedic timing and production and tricks of the trade. And it was all second nature to Joe. And that was quite a thrill. But anyway, just as I had been warned, My time as producer of the Steve Dahl and Gary Myers show soon came to an end. But because of the show's popularity, this was in the early 90s, and I had just graduated college. And I'm like, okay, well, now what do I do? And I knew what I wanted to do, which was segue from radio to work for a record company.
Mm,
And fortunately for me, that radio show, Steve and Gary and The Loop, was so popular that all of the people who worked for the record companies in Chicago listened to that show. And so I had become an involuntary celebrity um, because of that show. I guess the best way to explain it to in more contemporary terms is, I was the Baba Booey equivalent to the Howard Stern equivalent in Chicago radio in those days. And I've actually, now that I've worked at SiriusXM for so many years, I've become friendly with Baba Booey. It's Gary Dell'Abate, who is a lovely man, a very talented producer. I mean, I don't think he gets enough credit for how talented he is because let me tell you, producing a major radio show in the morning or in the afternoon drive, it is much, much, much more difficult than you think. And when you're working mornings, that means your day starts at about 3:30 in the morning,
yeah.
and then you do your radio show. The radio show itself probably ends at 10 in the morning, and then you have to start booking guests for the next show and the next show and the next show. So you would start at 3:30 in the morning, and then you'd probably leave at 6 or 7 at night. And you never stopped. You worked on weekends too, but you became this involuntary celebrity. At least I did. So when I went looking for jobs, uh, following the Loop experience, people would say, "Wait, you're Randy from the Steve and Gary show? Oh my God, what's it like working for Steve and Gary? And what's the Loop like?" So they did me a tremendous service in terms of helping me get noticed and ultimately hired by one of the big seven major record companies. So in those days, there were seven major record companies in the world. Now there are only three due to mergers and
Hmm.
consolidations. But
Hmm.
in those days, I worked for what was PolyGram Records. PolyGram was a subsidiary of Philips Electronics based in the Netherlands. Um,
And I think they also had Polygram Entertainment, where did films, if I'm not mistaken.
that's
But go on.
correct.
Right.
Yes. And that's called foreshadowing what you just did. Very good. Very good. Yes. So I got hired by Polygram in Chicago because, again, in those days, not only were there seven major record companies, but in the United States, they had regional offices in about seven or eight major cities across the country, Chicago being one of them. Um, and I remember when I first got hired, excuse me, by Polygram, the first task I had, I was a promotions assistant originally for Island Records. And as luck would have it, that same band that we talked about earlier, that poor guy was
Hmm.
waiting in line for concert tickets for, U2. Well, by that time, U2 was the biggest band in the world. And they had a little album called Achtung Baby. So when I joined Island, or what was then part of what was called Polygram Label Group, um, I remember my first job was single number 4 from Achtung Baby, which is a great song called Even Better Than the Real Thing. And I
Mm.
remember my boss at the time, he handed me this record and the CD and said, Randy, if you can't get this played on the radio, you are in the wrong business. So not only did we have no problems getting that U2 record played on the radio, but we used it as leverage along with concert tickets to get other lesser known artists played on the radio. And many of them never amounted to anything, but a few of them did. And the two that really stand out from those days that I was very honored to work with and helped. I mean, I was a small part of the team across the country that really built up these artists and got them played on the radio. But one was a wonderful artist, singer-songwriter, Melissa Etheridge,
Mm-hmm.
who's still doing it today. She's amazing. And another was a group from Ireland called the Cranberries. And, sadly, the lead singer of the Cranberries, Dolores, died several years ago. But I mean, I remember taking the Cranberries around in my Honda Civic, driving them around to radio stations in Chicago, getting them interviewed. Nobody knew who they were. They had never been to America before, uh, and that was an exciting time. But I was in working for PolyGram in first promotions and then sales and marketing. Um, because I kind of quickly did my best to segue to sales and marketing because, promotions was fun, but it always seemed a little bit, a little bit greasy to me. And because you would get records played on the radio, but which was important, of course. But for me, it was more important to say, um, look how many units we sold. And
Mm.
by that time, SoundScan, which is, was the industry standard, like that was still relatively new. So for me, it was much more meaningful to say we drove X amount of sales and X amount of units versus we got X amount of spins or ads on a radio station because half the time you'd later learn that those spins on the radio station happened at like 3 in the morning when no one was listening. So, like how impactful was that? But the sales were actual sales and
Sure.
the scans would be actual scans. And it was all very quantifiable and real data. And so I felt good about that. So I wanted to transition from the promotions department to the sales and marketing department. And I was working for the label for PolyGram in Chicago for 2 years, and then got the call from headquarters in New York and got the big promotion and was like, okay, here we go. My dream of getting a full-time career in the music business and moving from Chicago to New York is about to be realized. So I moved to New York City. I was about 24 years old. This was in the mid 90s. And it's a very exciting time. And then I was working primarily for the Verve label, the Venerable Jazz label.
Yep.
Um, Not because I was such a jazz aficionado, although I quickly became one, but because that was the position that was open, right? Because what I quickly learned, because obviously, remember, I'm coming from my love of the Beatles, right? So I wanted to, like almost everyone else, I wanted to be working for a major rock label or a major pop label. But those jobs were very hard to come by. It was extremely competitive. And also, what I noticed from my friends who were in those jobs is about every 12 to 18 to 24 months, there'd be a lot of turnover. that
Hmm.
revolving door again.
Right.
But fewer people were coveting the jobs on the jazz and classical side of the business. And because, first of all, you had to be a little bit smarter and more clever, not only to appreciate those genres of music, but also to figure out how to handle sales and marketing for those genres, because in almost all of those cases, there was no radio airplay, or maybe there was radio airplay on non-commercial public radio stations, but those didn't really amount to any sales. So, as sexy and cool and attractive as it was to work for Island Records or Mercury Records or A&M Records or Interscope Records or all of those labels. And I had many friends and still have many friends at those labels, or the ones that are still around. I would notice that again, every couple of years, my friends would lose their jobs and they'd be shuffled around to other labels. But those who worked on the classical and jazz side tended to stick around.
Hmm.
And part of the reason they tended to stick around is because those labels, and certainly this was the case at PolyGram, which was the worldwide leader in classical and jazz music at the time, with some of the most prestigious labels in the world. I mean, Decca and Deutsche Grammophon and Philips and certainly Verve. But those labels made money and turned a nice profit without spending a lot of money because you didn't have radio promotion costs and the advertising costs were minimal because you were catering to a very devoted audience that was older. These weren't kids buying these
Yeah.
records, and they were inclined to spend money. And unlike today, whether it's my kids or your kids or anyone, one of your listeners' kids, they feel like they shouldn't have to spend money for music, that everything should be free. That wasn't the case back in the 90s.
Hmm.
And as a result, especially with people replacing their vinyl collections with CDs, which I know you remember, um, the record labels, all the record companies in the 90s were experiencing double-digit growth year over year, whether it was deserved or not, frankly. Just the money was rolling in. And it was a good place to be. And it was fun. And especially being immersed at such a young age in New York City, working for some of the biggest names on the planet in classical and jazz music. I mean, for work, we told go to Carnegie Hall, go to the Blue Note, go to the Village Vanguard, and work with Herbie Hancock and work with the three tenors, Pavarotti and the three tenors. And so I quickly got up to speed on those genres of music and learned from experts in the field on how to package and repackage that music for new audiences. And I think you see where I'm going with this. So what happened at the very end of the 90s, was that PolyGram was acquired by Seagram, by Edgar Bronfman Jr., and merged with Universal Music.
Hmm.
And at the time, Universal Music was strong in the United States, but not so strong outside of the United States. Whereas PolyGram was not so strong in the United States, but very strong internationally. So it was a good fit strategically. Um, but in those days, and this is 1999 and 2000, all of Universal was under one umbrella. It was under the Seagram company. And we were encouraged to maximize synergies between the business units. So the music group where I was working
Mm-hmm.
And by that time, I had segued from Verve to Decca, which ironically, given the fact that I'm a lifelong Beatles fan, was the label that famously turned down the Beatles. But that's an
Ah, okay.
but Decca and the Decca label group in those days was most famous for a few things. Certainly the three tenors, which I mentioned, and under the Decca label group umbrella was Deutsche Grammophon and Philips. And I was very fortunate enough to be part of the team, a very talented team that launched the career of Andrea Bocelli in the United States. And was very fortunate. I mean, it's all about timing, right? It was
Of
very
course.
fortunate that when the merger of Universal Music and PolyGram happened, so many of my friends and colleagues were let go. And that's what happens when companies merge, right? And I
Yep.
remember the good folks at Boston Consulting Group, they went around to every floor in the building in Manhattan and would meet with every department, trying to understand who was vitally important to the future of the business and who they should let go.
Right.
And I remember they looked at our numbers and they were very strong mainly because of Andrea Bocelli, who is just becoming a superstar at just the right time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember they basically said something to us like, because another stroke of good luck was that the new Universal Music Group, once it was, once Universal merged with PolyGram, for every single genre of music, there was on the PolyGram side, there was a counterpart on the Universal side, except for classical. And we had this burgeoning superstar named Andrea Bocelli, who was becoming famous for his duets with Sarah Brightman and then later Celine Dion. And so I remember they basically said to our team, we don't really understand your business, the classical music business, but your numbers are really good, so we're going to leave you alone. We were like, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. And that was more or less what happened. Round about that time, and this is where you and I uh, soon became in touch with one another. There's only one Andrea Bocelli, right? There's only one Luciano Pavarotti. Um, so we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to grow our business? And one way was when this merger happened, they didn't know the new company, Universal, wasn't really sure what to do with Broadway cast recordings. And believe me, there was a huge catalog of those, all the Andrew Lloyd Webber shows and Phantom of the Opera and countless others, Cats, so many of those. And you know, the Decca label group sort of became the place where it's music for adults, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a Broadway cast album or if it's Andrea Bocelli or a sort of a jazz album or a new age album. We'll park it with the folks at Decca because they're smart and they can figure out how to sell something that doesn't have a radio single. Like how do they do it? And the way we did it was that PBS, public broadcasting, was our MTV, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
how the Three Tenors became so successful. That's how Bocelli became so successful. And it was a very interesting business model. But soon we were saying, okay, well, what more can we do? And then what would happen is big rock stars like Sting or Elvis Costello would have vanity projects, right? And so they would say, yeah, we're going to put our rock records out through the rock labels. So Elvis Costello would be with Island and um, Sting would be through A&M, which was part of Interscope, and Interscope Geffen A&M in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And but then they would convince the powers that be to allow them to do some vanity projects. So for Sting, he would have a jazz project or a classical project, and same with Elvis Costello. So they'd say, "Oh, give it to the guys at Decca." And so ultimately, I would be tasked with coming up with marketing campaigns for these albums. And I was thrilled because, now I was slowly creeping toward the rock music that I love so much. But I also had grown to love all these other genres too.
Mm-hmm.
Then someone came up with the bright idea. It wasn't anyone in America, but it was a team of some very clever people in the UK that decided we're going to do a Broadway musical. Well, it started in the West End of London, based on the music of ABBA. But it's not going to have ABBA in it. It's just going to have their music set to a basically a story that would be suitable for a rom-com, a romantic comedy. And this was 1999 or 2000. So they said, Randy, you got to fly over to London and meet up with our Universal Music colleagues in London and go see this musical called Mamma Mia.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to get the album to Mamma Mia, the Broadway cast album, because at first it's going to, open in London, and then it's going to come to New York and open on Broadway. And then ultimately it went to Los Angeles. And I remember being at the premieres of all three of those, London, Broadway, Los Angeles. But I was like, why would anybody want to buy an album of other people singing ABBA songs when they could buy ABBA's greatest hits? And the ABBA Gold album to this day is one of the biggest sellers in the PolyGram, now Universal Music catalog. It's like, why would anyone want to pay money to hear other people, actors, sing Dancing Queen when you could hear ABBA sing Dancing Queen? And he said, Randy, don't ask so many questions. Just
Just
go
do
over
it.
there, watch, just go see the show and come back to New York and tell us what happened. And have you ever seen Mamma Mia? I mean, you've probably seen the movie, right?
I've seen the movie. I've seen clips from the show because I remember when I was going to university, I it used to play at uh, Princess of Wales Theater here in Toronto, and also another theater. I forget the name. Yeah, I forget the name. But I remember seeing those posters of the girl with the white outfit and
That's
just kind of
right.
like laughing and smiling, right? So I
That's
remember that.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
So anyway, I watched this. I watched this musical in London. I immediately recognized that I'm one of the only men in the audience. It's almost all women. But then at the end, everybody, the cast and the audience, everyone's on their feet dancing and singing Waterloo, Dancing Queen. And I look around and I see the joy on everyone's faces. And then leaving the theater, everyone wants a souvenir of that moment. So they all flock to the merch table and they buy CDs of what they just heard, the cast singing the music of ABBA. And they also bought lots of other things, t-shirts and all sorts of merch. And I saw this and I saw everyone and the joy on everyone's faces, female faces. And I thought, oh, okay, now I understand. And so I came back and told the team in New York, like, we are going to have a lot of fun with this one, and we are all going to make a lot of money. And and so we did. And then a few years later, there was another, this time an original Broadway musical that came to us called Wicked. And I
Mm.
remember the day that we knew who Kristen Chenoweth was, but none of us had ever heard of Idina Menzel. She was a relatively new Broadway up and coming star. And I remember she came to our offices and met with us, and we all saw Wicked and we loved it straight away, the Broadway show. But from a marketing standpoint, Wicked and Mamma Mia had one very important thing in common, and they still do, because as of course we all know, these went from being fabulously successful Broadway musicals to fabulously successful Hollywood motion pictures. And with sequels and everything. But from a marketing standpoint, what was most telling and also most unusual was that each of these shows, Mamma Mia and Wicked, attracted three generations of women. So in the audiences, you would see grandmothers and their daughters and their daughters, the grandmothers, daughters, and granddaughters, three generations of women and their friends all going to see these Broadway musicals and later these Hollywood motion pictures and having the time of their lives and singing. And so for many, many years, I handled marketing and a lot of direct to consumer marketing for these two projects, as well as Andrea Bocelli. And then here's the part where you come into the picture. Um, in those days, and this was around the year 2000,
Mm-hmm.
we could, I mean, remember, Tower Records was still around, and they were a huge driver of sales of all genres of music. They were huge stores. I miss Tower Records very much to this day. Living in LA, I drive by the location of the one on Sunset, the legendary Tower Records on Sunset, and I can't believe it's gone, which is very sad. But in the year 2000, Tower was still around, and it accounted for about nearly 50% of our record company's business in those days, which
Mm.
again was all physical sales, right? This was the year before the iTunes store debuted, the year before iPods debuted, right? So in those days, if you had a hit movie, it almost wouldn't even matter what the soundtrack was. If you were attached to a hit movie, and believe me, now that we were part of Universal Studios, Universal Pictures, uh, there were a lot of hit movies to be part of. And literally in those days, even if it wasn't a great soundtrack with a hit song on it, we could ship a minimum of 50,000 units in the United States just for anything. So what would end up happening is the number crunchers on our finance department would look at at the end of each quarter, they'd look at our numbers and they'd say, we're about $1 million short for the quarter. And then they'd look at me and they'd say, Randy, get on a plane, fly to Los Angeles, meet with the heads of film and TV music in at Universal Pictures in Los Angeles, but not just Universal Pictures. I mean, go to Universal first because that's what we're supposed to do. We're
Right.
supposed to maximize synergies, but also meet with the folks at DreamWorks and at Fox and even at some of our competitors that had major music companies like Sony. But it was primarily Universal and DreamWorks and Fox in those days for our label group, which was Decca.
Right.
And I instantly became very popular because I would walk into these fabulous corner offices on these Hollywood movie studio lots and with basically my checkbook open, like a blank check. And I'd say, hey, I'm Randy Dry from Decca Universal Music in New York. We're in the soundtracks business. Do you have any major films coming up that have soundtracks attached to them? And by soundtracks, primarily what I'm talking about were film scores, which up until that point, people weren't really paying much attention to film scores until composers like, well, certainly John Williams, but also James Horner, and we had had success with Braveheart many years earlier, and then a little project called Titanic came out, and all of a
Hmm.
sudden it was typically a bidding war between Universal or Decca and Sony, usually on the other side, for the big major film scores. So I remember year 2000, just a few of us in New York City, we were put into a very small screening room and we were told, we're going to watch a rough cut of this new action-packed blockbuster film that's going to harken back to the days of Rome, ancient Rome, and Ben-Hur and these types of big widescreen CinemaScope movies from many, many decades ago. But the movie wasn't even finished and the music wasn't finished. Like we were hearing temp cues and we didn't know what to expect. And it wasn't exactly, it was a tiny screening room for such a huge production. And so we saw a rough cut of Gladiator and we were blown away. I mean, we just couldn't believe it. And our president at the time, Chris Roberts, he was very attuned to Hans Zimmer and he was he was completely sold on Hans Zimmer. I had never heard of Hans Zimmer before.
Oh, really?
Um, yes, because this was a new world to me, film scores.
Yeah, yeah.
And I quickly learned all about Hans Zimmer and what a fabulous human being he is and what an amazingly talented composer of music he is. So, but we were blown away by this movie. And so we got the rights for the soundtrack. And then when we saw the finished product and heard this score, which was one of the first times, other than let's say Star Wars or Jaws or something like that, um, when you could actually listen to a film score on its own and enjoy it. Like you weren't just buying it because it was a souvenir of a
Yeah.
movie you loved. It was
Yeah.
because you actually enjoyed the music, which was rare among film scores in those days, and still, really. Um, and so we did a number of projects with Hans Zimmer. None was bigger than Gladiator, but we did Hannibal, the sequel to Silence of the
Hmm.
Lambs, which
Hmm.
was amazing, and a host of others. Um, but oh my God, what a thrill! I will never forget. I was fortunate enough to spend one evening with Hans Zimmer in his studio in Los Angeles and saw how he worked and what a kind man. And by then I had learned like, oh, this is the guy who had the first ever music video played on MTV, Video Killed the Radio Star with the Buggles. Like I learned all about his history and how he made the transition from pop music to film scores, as did Danny Elfman, right? Like from Oingo Boingo to Batman or all the other movies that he
Yep.
scored. And then, but so for about 6 years, in addition to my marketing duties for Decca and Universal Music, I was also head of marketing and A&R for soundtracks and Broadway shows. But by A&R, um, it wasn't a traditional A&R role, meaning I wasn't like working with the composer and saying, I think you should put this song here and this song here. Um, as you know, in the world of film scores, what it really was, I was more or less a talent scout, and I would spend about 1 week in Los Angeles every other month. I would fly in from New York, and it was loads of fun. I mean, I would be I was introduced to this very small and wonderful world of music supervisors in Hollywood and film studio executives who were huge music fans, extremely knowledgeable. And I would go to these. not just premieres, but more often than not, there'd be these little screenings. And
Mm.
sometimes this would be like at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'd be the only person in this beautiful upholstered screening room, and certainly DreamWorks had a beautiful one and still does, right? And so we did a lot of projects with DreamWorks and other studios. And, I remember many of them with Universal, and certainly Randy Newman's score for Seabiscuit was one that comes to mind. James Horner's score for A Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe, another
Hmm.
Oscar-winning picture from from Russell Crowe, uh, beside Oscar Crowe. He basically was Oscar Crowe after Gladiator and Beautiful Mind, and and it was wonderful, and having conversations with directors like Ron Howard and uh, Tom Hanks, and these amazing films, but the common theme was always music for adults, and how can we, so literally it was it was driven by the financial side of the business, and they'd say, Randy, we're $1 million short this quarter. Go and sign us 5 soundtracks and we'll make up the shortfall. And then come back in a few months and sign us a few more. And some of them were fabulous, like the ones I mentioned, some not so fabulous. But even the ones that were not so fabulous in those days, we would ship a minimum of 50,000 units, and that would help us make our numbers for the quota for that quarter. Um, so Anyway, I realize I've been talking a long time. Do you have
No,
any
no, no,
questions
you're
or
no, no,
filling
you're
my time?
fine. No, no, no. I'm loving it. I'm just loving what you're saying, and I was just thinking about as you just paused. I wonder if I still have. I know I do. I don't know if I have accessible the Gladiator soundtrack. I know I still have the promotional copy that you sent. Just give me a second. It's
Well,
somewhere
yes,
there.
well, I know I have it on the wall to my left here. Um, and I remember when you and I met, it was because you were working for the DreamWorks home video division, yes?
No, I was not working for DreamWorks. That's the oops.
Oh,
That's
am I
the
wrong? Okay.
yeah. So this is actually
Sorry.
Road to Perdition, what you
Road to
guys did.
Perdition with Tom Hanks,
Yeah, yeah.
and that was Newman, right? David Newman?
Yes. No, Thomas Newman.
Thomas Newman.
No, I didn't work for DreamWorks. So what I was doing was, so I wanted to get into film business, but I was studying IT, and I happened to take this course, and I flunked it, and I started this test website on Steven Spielberg, and it blew up to
Okay.
DreamWorks, and then it just from there on, it just like I was 10 years, I was like ridiculously working hard on DreamWorks films. So it was nothing officially affiliated with DreamWorks in any way. It
Oh,
was
see,
just
I didn't even know that. I just knew you as someone I knew through my soundtrack work with DreamWorks.
no, no, no. It was just like I remember I emailed you. You even organized an interview with Hans Zimmer over email. I still remember that. And I have I launched this message board on Gladiator, which I didn't. I had like
That's right.
I had a message board on all the DreamWorks films and just one message board for this season. Somehow I launched a message board and it blew up, and it was like 50 plus women, pretty much. That's all it was. And I was at the time 24, 25, and I'm interacting with these
Isn't that amazing?
much
Yeah.
older fans and all that, and yeah, it became that message board ran for 6 years just talking about Gladiator over and over again. Russell Crowe, and there was
Yeah.
always
Well,
something
I
going.
think this is very telling, and because a lot of people, I mean, this really wasn't that long ago, right? I mean, we're talking about
No,
25 years ago, 24 years ago. Um, but it may as well have been 100 years ago because, again, there was almost no social media,
no,
virtually,
nothing.
virtually
Yeah,
none.
yeah.
Um, no iPhones, no social media. But there were people like you that were curating and cultivating these fan communities online, whether it was a message board or a chat room. And we meaning on the record company side and on the marketing side, we were like, "Oh, this is good. This is what we used to call in those days, it was a viral marketing. Like, how can it go viral?"
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it was essentially grassroots marketing, but it was being done online instead of in the physical world.
100%. And I'll tell you one more thing. So I gotta thank you for this. I just realized this. So at the time when Gladiator came out, it was 2000, and my website was 3 years old. It was still growing, but nothing rapidly. And I used to approach like studios and record companies, like and toy manufacturers. We want to do a contest because I wanted to grow the audience,
Yeah.
and nobody gave two craps about what I was doing. And you were the first one who actually did that. And after that, I used that as a template. Okay, Decca Records has done this, so you better do it too, right? And it started working. Like there was another label called Vera Saraband, which used to do
Yes, well,
soundtracks.
Perez Sarabam was always around, and they would have
Yeah,
what we would call like the lower budget
yeah.
projects.
And I remember going to I used to have my own P.O. box at the post office. And I remember going to the post office, putting each CD in the envelope, writing out the addresses. I think it was like 50 CDs that I mailed from Gladiator. Just
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
just like that. So that started everything in terms of me doing like a lot of, and I learned how to sort of do promotions and marketing, if you want to call it. I mean, I'm not. I learned a lot in terms of promotion, sales, and marketing from
It's
those 10
direct to
years.
consumer marketing. You were doing it at the post
Yeah,
office, even. I
yeah,
mean,
exactly.
it's amazing.
Yeah.
No, I mean, those were really fun, exciting days. One more quick soundtrack story because it's
Sure, would love to.
one of my favorites is so in those days, hard to believe now, but in the year 2000, Hollywood wasn't yet sold on Marvel Comics. Okay? Like the blockbuster Marvel universe of superhero movies hadn't really happened yet. I think had been one
Spider-Man
Spider-Man movie through
and
Sony.
and Hellboy, which came I think a couple of years before that, which wasn't, I don't know if
Yes,
it's
but
Marvel or not.
Hellboy wasn't, a known
Yeah,
entity like Spider-Man was,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But yes. And so on one of my trips to Los Angeles, I was meeting with Fox and a gentleman who is now, head of film music at Universal, and for many years, uh, Mike Knobloch, and wonderful, super talented, creative man, and I still bump into him every now and then. And they had a little movie called X-Men. Now,
Hmm.
all of my colleagues, because remember, like at Decca, it was largely populated by people that were steeped in knowledge of classical and jazz and Broadway. They didn't know from X-Men. They didn't like they knew Spider-Man. They didn't know X-Men. And in addition to being a music lover when I was a little boy, I was also into comic books, and I love Marvel comics, and I loved X-Men, and I knew what X-Men was all about. But unless you were one of those comic book kids, you didn't know what X-Men was all about in the year 2000. And so I remember coming back to New York and I said, I got us a film score for Fox's big summer blockbuster film, X-Men. It's Marvel Comics. And they were like, what the heck is X-Men? Why would we do this? And I said, you got to trust me on this. This is going to be a big deal because other than Patrick Stewart and Halle Berry, it wasn't like Brad Pitt was starring in this
Yeah,
movie, right?
yeah.
Um, and it wasn't Spider-Man or Superman or Batman, so they didn't know. And and I'd like to sit here and say that Decca decided to greenlight the soundtrack because of my recommendation. I think it had more to do with the fact that the composer was Michael Kamen,
Yeah.
and our label president knew Michael Kamen from Mr. Holland's Opus and the score he had done for that, and knew how talented Michael Kamen was, and also knew that Michael Kamen had a knack for, not just classical film score, but he could inject a little rock and roll, which later really manifested itself when he, would be scoring orchestras with Metallica, but that came later. But so this little X-Men project did quite well. And then all of a sudden, Hollywood started warming up to the lesser known Marvel franchises, and we all know what happened from
Yeah.
there. So we did a few very successful superhero film score soundtracks. The other one that comes to mind was the Hulk, which
With
was
Eric Bana, right? I think it
Eric
was.
Bana, and the there was actually a hit single, a rock track on that album that was played over the end credits by a group that was formed for that project called Velvet Revolver, which was essentially Guns N' Roses, but without Axl Rose, right? It was really Slash, who, as you and others know, has a long history of performing guitar or playing guitar parts in major motion pictures and for several soundtracks, and among his day job with Guns N' Roses, and a nicer, more talented man you'd be hard pressed to find than Slash. Just an amazingly talented human being. And and I grew up watching, Lou Ferrigno as the Hulk on TV in the late 70s. So I knew all about Hulk. And quite frankly, the Hulk movie wasn't great, but people wanted a souvenir. Like it just like if we could be a part of that massive franchise, and Universal did everything they could to maximize synergies with the Hulk, like in the Universal theme park, there was a Hulk attraction, and there were, obviously DVDs and tons of merch, and the obviously the film itself. So just to be a small part of that major franchise with a compact disc meant that we were going to turn a profit. So yeah, that
No,
was good.
that's X. So X-Men, I remember. So it was partially shot in Toronto. Um,
Yes.
the Casa Loma. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Casa Loma. It's kind of like a venue where they have like all these historical like nights and stuff, and there's events that
Oh,
take
I
place.
see. So that was
So
the Academy.
the that was all Casa Loma. I remember going to the set and it was closed set, and I tried to sneak in, but that didn't work. And also the Hulk, there was certain sequence that was filmed in Toronto at University of Toronto when he I think fights with the
Oh,
military and stuff. Yeah, there was certain
okay.
sequence that were done in Toronto. So it's interesting that you're talking about Marvel. So I never grew up with comics, right? I remember I used to watch Batman, the Tim Burton Batman, and I used to watch Batman the animated series. I had seen Superman 3 and 4, and I think the first one. I never saw the second one. Saw
Second one's the
Spider.
best one.
I know I never saw it until recently. Until recently, and then Spider-Man I loved, and I didn't mind the Hulk, but when Iron Man came out, from
Well,
that
that
point
was the
on.
game changer. Yes, that was the game changer.
It was a game changer, but funny enough, the only superhero movies that I've watched since Iron Man, if you want to call them, the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, and that's it. Like I just can I've not been able to get into the superhero world.
Really?
Maybe because I didn't grow up with comics, or I've tried myself a few times. It just hasn't worked.
Okay. Well, look,
Interesting, just the point.
there's something for everyone out there, obviously, but it's hard, like, because I remember explaining to my kids that, who are so used to the Marvel, universe and the multiverse. And I remember saying, there was a time not so long ago where it took a long time and lots of money and lots of people losing money trying to develop Hollywood scripts for Marvel projects.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
the Spider-Man movie that eventually got made by Sony in the late 90s, I mean, that went through so many rewrites and stop starts, and because no one had any confidence that it that people were going to pay money to see it. It sounds silly to say. And then when X-Men took off, that took a lot of people by surprise because nobody knew, unless you were a comic book fanatic, nobody knew what X-Men was all about. And like I said, it was all like if it was comic book, you knew Spider-Man, Superman, Batman. That
Yeah,
was those
that's
three you
true.
knew.
That's true. No,
Then all of a sudden they were like, well, let's do Ghost Rider and let's do the obviously Black Widow or all these like minor
yeah.
characters, Silver Surfer, so but that's how it all went. I sort of teased this earlier when I was talking and lamenting the loss of Tower Records, but in 2006, Tower went bankrupt. And I'll never forget this. I was head of marketing for Decca, and I went into our head of sales office, and he was a dear, still a dear friend, Jerry Kopecki, and he was a very seasoned and smart uh, record company executive who had been head of sales at Island Records for many years, including the heyday with U2 and all of that. And the sad thing about Tower is we were all customers as well as suppliers.
Mm-hmm.
So not only, we had a deep relationship, not just a business relationship, but a personal relationship because we knew all the buyers, we knew all the salespeople, and Russ Solomon and his whole team. And there was an opportunity for Tower to be saved. But unfortunately, as often happens in the world of, mergers and acquisitions, is that it was purchased and then basically they stripped it clean, closed all the stores. And I remember sitting in Jerry Kopecki's office with a few other people, senior executives at our label, and we looked at each other and we knew we were in big trouble. And because you don't have to be a math genius to know that if roughly 50% of your business is with Tower Records, you can't replace that
Yeah,
business.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe if you're lucky, you'll replace 10% of it with a then upstart company that was starting to sell CDs called Amazon. But in those days, 50% of our business roughly was with Tower. And then the rest of it was sort of divided between uh, two bookstore chains, one that doesn't exist anymore called Borders Books and Music, and then
I
one,
remember that.
yeah, and then one that does still exist called Barnes and Noble, but there aren't that many Barnes and Nobles
Mm-hmm.
anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But, unlike Tower, which, Tower was always first and foremost about records, about music. They had books and they had other things, but it was all about music. Borders and Barnes and Noble were all about books, and they also had some music because they used that to get people in the door so they would buy books.
Sure.
By that time, Best Buy was around, and Best Buy, same thing. They would undercut. That was the other reason why Tower went bankrupt, is because Best Buy strategically would open a store across the street from Tower in every major market around the world, around the United States and Canada, literally across the street. And whereas Tower would be selling CDs for 15.99,
Mm-hmm.
Best Buy would sell them for 9.99. And they were undercutting their competition right across the street, luring the customers away. And then the stores would close and all these people would be out of business. And so it took a few years, but that's ultimately why Tower went under. And the streaming business was still in its infancy. I mean, there was no streaming yet. It was downloads, it was
Yeah.
people were purchasing downloads through the iTunes store, but that was a very small part of our business. And people in the music business that had been used to years, I mean, record company executives who had been used to years of double-digit growth, whether they deserved it or not, as I mentioned before, because people were replacing their vinyl collections with CDs.
Yeah.
And the margins were ridiculous. I mean, it didn't cost much to make a CD, and then you could sell it. In some cases, they'd sell for $20 or $18 or $15.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, those CD sales were dwindling. And so we knew we were in big trouble. And we knew it was a time of massive change in the music business that was coming. It was a seismic shift. And I was very happy at Universal Music. I loved my job. I loved my team. I just loved being a part of it. And I still have nothing but good memories of Universal Music. But I remember thinking to myself, and I had a good contract and I had like just renewed. And I remember thinking, if Tower goes away, we are all going to be in big trouble and nothing's going to save us. So I better start looking around.
Mm.
Otherwise, I'm just going to get packaged out like every one of my friends and colleagues here. And it was around that time, 2006, that another person that came up earlier in the story, Howard Stern, had signed with this startup company called Sirius Satellite Radio, and in New York, and stunned everyone by leaving terrestrial radio, where he was constantly being fined by the FCC for what he was saying on
Mm-hmm.
the air or what they thought he was saying. And everyone thought, in those days, there were two competing satellite radio companies, XM, which was the first and the bigger of the two, and they were based in Washington, D.C., and Sirius, which was based in New York City. Um, and very conveniently, 3 blocks from my office at Universal.
Mm.
And it's still there. There are the SiriusXM headquarters now is at Rockefeller Center in Midtown, and my office in those days at Universal was just a few blocks away, and same scenario exists today. And I loved the energy at Sirius and XM. And everyone thought the smart money was that Howard Stern was going to sign with XM because they were the bigger one, and they had many more listeners and they were more well established. But of course, Howard shocked everyone and decided to sign with Sirius. And I think it's safe to say that if that hadn't happened, then Sirius probably wouldn't exist today. It would just be XM. But because of Howard, primarily, Sirius ended up acquiring XM a few years
Mm-hmm.
later. But both companies nearly went bankrupt. It was a very exciting time, but it was a scary time. This was the late 2000s. Um, but I had a longtime friend who I had originally met at Island and at PolyGram in the early 90s, named Steve Leeds, who is a wonderful human being, music industry veteran. He and his brother Harvey Leeds, who Harvey worked at Sony for many years. Steve was the original head of talent at MTV, who hired the VJs and then segued to the record company side. Actually, he started at the record company side, then went to MTV, then went back to the record company side.
Right.
And we became fast friends. Long story short, he was now working for this new upstart company, Sirius Satellite Radio. And in those days, Sirius was the people working there were mainly radio people, right? They were mainly people from terrestrial radio who were interested in this new technology. There was almost no one from the record company side, because, you know, frankly, no one really thought anyone would ever pay for radio. Why would you pay for something that was free?
Yeah.
And I remember when I went to work at Sirius and left Universal, everyone I knew said, "What are you, crazy? Like, why would you leave Universal? The biggest music company on the planet for this upstart satellite radio. Like, nobody's going to pay for radio." And there
No.
were two reasons I did that. Number one, Howard Stern. Never bet against Howard. A true visionary, uh, king of all media. The other is just the energy from day one when I walked into Sirius. It was just contagious, the passion. And it was such a refreshing change from the lack of energy that sadly had, become commonplace at the record labels because we were all scared about losing our jobs, especially when Tower declared, when they filed for Chapter 11 and declared bankruptcy. We knew it was a matter of time, and it was all about the bottom line. And it was a lot of people we know were getting let go, and there were more and more mergers and consolidations and layoffs. But then a few blocks away was this wonderful, creative, throw it against the wall and see if it sticks satellite radio company. And I was reminded of my love of music radio when the programmers were allowed to be creative and
Mm,
most importantly, no commercials, right? So for a music lover like you and like me, I mean, this is like,
no
not
brainer.
only would I pay for this, but I'd willingly pay for this. Like I would tell all my friends, like, remember, this was before Spotify came over here.
Hmm.
And this was a good 5 years before then. So the president and still president and chief content officer of SiriusXM, a brilliant, uh, creative genius, media executive named Scott Greenstein, who came from the film world. And I had done, he started with Miramax and then had segued to October Films and what then became known as USA Films and ultimately Focus Features, and had some pretty successful films uh, in those very early 2000s. And that's when I was hustling, trying to get whatever soundtracks I could for Decca. So I did a couple of soundtrack deals with Scott, very forgettable, small projects. But I knew Scott a little bit, but I knew him enough so that when I would, in my in my role at Universal, and I mentioned earlier, we would have artists like Sting and Elvis Costello who would have these vanity projects, and we couldn't get them played on the radio, but satellite radio would play them. And I knew Steve Leeds and I knew Scott Greenstein, and it was 3 blocks away. So I would bring Sting or Elvis Costello over to Sirius Satellite Radio, and I would make sure that they would pop their head in and say hello to Scott, which he very much appreciated because, again, Sirius, we were a very small startup company in those days.
Yeah,
And other than Howard Stern and the NFL and some music channels,
nobody there was
um,
there. Yeah.
wasn't much going on. And so I remember one day oh, and plus Mamma Mia, Scott was and is a huge ABBA fan. So to Scott, I became known as, oh, here comes Randy, the Mamma Mia guy, right? So that didn't hurt either, being associated with Mamma Mia, and of course Andrea Bocelli. So I had a few uh, successes under my belt, certainly Gladiator 2 and Wicked. But I remember one day I popped my head into Scott's office and I said, Scott, I have to tell you, I adore listening to Sirius Satellite Radio. I listen in my office at Universal. It's amazing. I'm a paying subscriber. I can't get enough of it, but there's one thing I don't understand. There's tons of advertising that you do for Howard Stern that I totally understand. There's lots of advertising you do for the NFL football. Totally understand. But you have all these great music channels and you don't do anything to promote them. Why? And he said, Randy, you're right. We're still a startup company. We're not fully staffed yet. And we don't have anyone currently on our team focused on music marketing. And so I said, well, if and when you're ready to change that, please let me know because I would love to help you because I know I can help you. And you need someone like me with a music company, a record company background versus almost everyone else at Sirius who had a radio background. They didn't know sales and marketing of music from a record company side. And the record labels in those days were very suspicious of satellite radio. They were like, oh, we're not sure about these people and are they paying us enough? And it was it was no one was really betting on satellite radio, but
Right.
you know, anyway, so I started very persistently, but not in an annoying, pushy way, but I would gently lob ideas over the course of about a 9-month period when I would be sending ideas and marketing plans and PowerPoint decks to Scott and Steve Leeds and a few other executives there. Just like, and I
Yeah,
didn't
yeah.
even know if people were reading them, but I was just trying to show them, hey, if I were to work with you, here are some ideas. And I didn't know if they liked them or not. I would never hear anything, but I knew from Steve, who was on the inside, that they were reading them. And then one day, Howard Stern announced with much fanfare on his radio show that Sirius Satellite Radio is going to launch the world's first ever Grateful Dead channel. This was in 2007.
Hmm.
And within 1 hour, I had sent Scott and Steve Leeds a marketing plan. Here's how Sirius should market the Grateful Dead channel. And the very next day, I got a call from the then head of marketing at Sirius who said, Randy, Scott has been sharing your ideas with me and your marketing plans with me, and they're very impressive. And are you still interested in working here? And I said, yes. And they said, well, why don't you come in and talk to me and you can meet some other people on the team. And I thought maybe they'll hire me as a consultant, and again, everyone else thought I was crazy. Like, why would I leave Universal?
Right.
But I had the very rare opportunity to create my own gig, which was I was the one-man music marketing team at Sirius Satellite Radio. And so they hired me. And then my very first task was, Randy, remember that Grateful Dead marketing plan you wrote? Well, now you get to execute it. And I think this will be a good place to end this story because here I am now, more than 18 years later. I'm still at SiriusXM, except I have moved from New York to Los Angeles. Um, and yes, of course, we have long since proven that people will pay for a subscription audio service. And of course, people will pay even more for a subscription video service, but or just as much. And there are a lot more of those than there are subscription audio services. But in any case, I remember this was my first week on the job, and I was in Scott's office, and he said, "Okay, Randy, I know coming from Universal, you're used to working with big marketing budgets like for Andrea Bocelli and Mamma Mia. And but so how much money do you think you're going to need for the Grateful Dead channel launch campaign?" And remember, Scott came from the world of motion pictures. So he's thinking like we're gonna launch this channel, and he did the same thing with Howard Stern. Um, that the way we're going to launch it from a marketing and advertising standpoint is just like you would open a major motion picture. So big, like a lot of out of home and outdoor billboards
Right.
and full page ads in the New York Times and USA Today. So I remember he said to me, this is how you know it was 2007. He said, what do you think you need? Like $500,000? And now I had just started. I think this is maybe my third day on the job or something. And I had to watch, I had to choose my words very carefully here. And now I have worked with the Grateful Dead team ever since then, so it's over 18 years and the Grateful
Sure.
Dead, as you may know, were not only one of the most enduring and beloved rock bands of all time, but they're also one of the most enduring and beloved rock brands of all time. And they just sort of by accident invented and pioneered a lot of things that are very commonplace in the music business,
Sure.
uh, including ticket pre-sales. I mean, that,
Mm.
they used to, it's a bunch of hippies in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco that would literally open up envelopes of fans, sending them cash through the mail with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and then they'd send them back tickets because they were just early fans of the band that just wanted to see them and would see them anywhere. But there's a wonderful book that the president of Grateful Dead Productions, a wonderful man named Mark Pincus, who works for to this day at Warner Music and Rhino Entertainment. And when I started working with him and the Grateful Dead team, he gifted me this book. It's a really quick read, but it talks about how Grateful Dead, almost by accident, pioneered so much of what now has long been the standard in music marketing. And it's all about super serving your fans, right? So
100%.
I knew when Scott asked me this question, like $500,000 budget, I knew that in order to effectively reach Grateful Dead fans, just like you were reaching those 50 plus women on your message board talking about Gladiator,
Hmm.
um, it doesn't take much to engage a Grateful Dead fan base. You just need to know where to find them and then empower them to be brand ambassadors, and they'll do the rest. So I remember I thought hard and I said, listen, Scott, we could spend $500,000, but I think through a grassroots marketing campaign, employing much of the things that you used to do, message boards, chat rooms. By this time that the beginnings of social media were just
Hmm.
starting.
Right.
And so I remember saying, I think we could do the whole thing for about 75 grand. And he looked at me. It was like $75,000, not $500,000, really? I said, yeah, I think so. And Scott paused and he looked up at the ceiling and then he looked at me and then he looked at my new boss who was standing to my left and he goes, I like this guy. And I think that's probably why I still have a job.
No,
Uh, Employers tend to like when you save them money
of course.
and so, but I'm very, very fortunate to be able to do what I do. And I am very honored and privileged to, work on music marketing and at SiriusXM and manage a lot of our content partnerships with some of the most iconic artists ever, and some of them still among us, like Bruce Springsteen, and
Mhm.
some of them who are sadly no longer with us, like Tom Petty or Frank Sinatra or Elvis, or, obviously we talked about the Beatles, um, Grateful Dead, Fish, Dave Matthews Band. The list goes on and on and on. It's, Bon
Yeah,
Jovi, a lot of rock and a lot of country, Willie Nelson, Carrie Underwood, Eric Church, Kenny Chesney. I mean, and also working with institutions like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Grand Ole Opry and the Metropolitan Opera and Jazz at Lincoln Center. I mean, what an amazing gig, what an amazing opportunity for an amazing creative group of people. And it was very exciting to see Sirius, which then merged with XM, became SiriusXM, and to see this business that no one was, I mean, anyone who says that they thought SiriusXM was going to become a profitable business is probably lying. But we believed that our content was second to none, and we still believe that,
yeah, of course.
and that people would pay for it. And given our preferred position in the car, which now, of course, isn't such a preferred position because people can stream whatever the heck they want in
Yeah,
their cars through Bluetooth or Apple CarPlay. But in those days, that technology didn't exist, so you had to have the satellite radio that came factory installed in your car, and it was a wonderful idea that spent many years trying to become profitable and then ultimately did. Um,
and
but
most.
just,
Sorry,
it's
go
just
on.
a fun, it's just it was and still is an amazing creative opportunity. And, I'm very fortunate to work with so many talented and passionate people who are like you and I, and that, it all comes back to our love for the music. And, I can't think of anything else that I would, I'm too stupid to do anything else. This is, it's better than a real job. That's what I always say, what
No,
we
I
do.
get that. I totally get that, and I'm very thankful for what I do in terms of making films and telling stories, and you're in the music world, so that's amazing. And listen, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing so much detail and so many stories. I learned a lot about the music industry that I didn't know as much as you do, so I really appreciate that, and would love to connect with you again in person if I'm in LA, if you have time,
Absolutely.
and it would be fabulous. So thank you so much for all the work that you've done. You were kind of part of my life 25 years ago for a year, and it taught me a lot. So thank you so much, and thanks for joining today. I appreciate it.
You're so welcome. I thank you for asking me to be on your podcast and to share my story. Definitely look me up when you are in Los Angeles. And yeah, I think the best way to close this is just follow your passion, follow your dream, because you know m- most of our lives are spent sleeping.
Yeah,
So when you're awake, you better find something that you enjoy doing.
and
And if
do it great.
right? And if you, and exactly. And if you if you're fortunate enough to be able to do what you love and love what you do, then you're really never working a day in your life.
100%. That's been my feeling for the last probably 30 years. So I completely relate to that, and I appreciate that. And let's connect for sure.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much. And I hope you have a good rest of the evening.
You too, Randy. Take care. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.